Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. Joe, nice to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love having people like yourself on because it sounds like you have pretty varied experience for starting an agency, then building a SaaS product, which is a really interesting track because I almost feel like the agency world can just inspire so many other ideas to do so many other things. It's just such a jumping off point to potentially anything. But yeah, before we get into that, for those that don't know you, would you mind talking about your background a little bit and kind of how you got to starting Smart Pricing Table and so on?
Well, I was an agency owner myself. I had a web design company for about 12 years in the Seattle area. It's funny, I only actually hired my first employee, Dan, because I got repetitive stress injury, but ended up loving it. And the next 12 years was kind of my master's in business management and running an agency. We had a lot of fun. I'm a systems guy, and we tended to invest a lot into our process. And so we had a lot of in-house tools. And a big thing for me is I like business to go smooth. So I didn't care about having killer profit every month if it meant that, team morale could go down. I was really big about smooth sailing, steady growth, and built to last kind of thinking.
That's great. And to dig into that a little bit more, just to kind of give some context, would you mind talking about just the kind of work you were doing and the clients you were working with at that time?
We were high end at the agency still functioning today. It's at jordancrown.com. I sold it to a key employee, Cameron. He's great. And we decided, like a lot of agencies, we kind of petered around trying to figure out what our niche was. After reading Jim Collins' Good to Great, I loved it. And we decided to make our hedgehog concept WordPress sites. And so probably like the last 6 years of my ownership, we really just hit that hard, built systems. And as many of your listeners know, Dan, whenever you specialize, you start finding all these different efficiencies because you see patterns. Without patterns, you can't build. It's a lot harder to build efficiencies. One of our biggest projects was Bluetooth.com and kind of a flagship moment for the agency.
That's very cool. And what sort of, you mentioned you're a systems guy, what did those look like and how do you feel like you kind of excelled on the system side in terms of WordPress sites?
Well, one of the, I think of just the different systems we had at our agency. One of the big ones was actually the proposal software that today is now Smart Pricing Table. What happened was I was using PandaDocs and PandaDoc, and it's a great platform. It does a lot, but I wanted to be able to generate a scope of work really quickly. And, I was just kind of fighting with the system. It would take too long to load. They didn't have some of the features I was looking for. And so what we originally set out to do was we thought, hey, let's build a scope of work creator in-house. I don't want to bite off more than I can chew. Let's just piece off this little part and see if we can build something that makes scope of work generation easier. We'll then paste that back into PandaDoc. And we did that. It worked really, really well. It just only took a few more steps to finish it. And then we had exactly what we wanted, full suite where we could do e-signatures and all that kind of stuff. But that was an example of how, as an agency, we would invest time to make something way more efficient. Our system was good, but I wanted better. And so oftentimes we'd slow down and we'd rethink things and build out something that would benefit us.
Cool. That makes sense. And was that the reason you decided to sell ultimately, or were you inspired by that idea, or what sort of pushed you in that direction, if you want me asking?
I think a lot of agency folks have different dreams about SaaS because it doesn't seem like it's a crazy different world. I ended up selling, my wife and I had some education options for our kids out of state. And ultimately, I felt like I was holding my team back. So sold to a key employee. But one of the things that I found, and maybe some of your agency folks can connect with this, it's really freaking hard to do anything else when you're running an agency. Right. And so we actually had plans of taking this bet to the market probably about 4 years ago. But then you have a big project like Bluetooth land and it doesn't matter. So the agency life was the priority. Getting stuff done for our clients and doing the work well was really important. And so it never really got off the ground until I decided to do it full time. Always wanted to and finally did about 1.5 years ago.
Awesome. That makes sense. And to get into what you're doing now, I guess, how are most agencies getting scope of work and pricing tables and proposals wrong? Like, how do you see that playing out most of the time?
I think that a lot of times what's happening with agencies is what we tend to do is, we'll have a proposal from 3, 4 months ago. We'll search through our inbox, try to find the PDF, and you're doing a lot of copying and pasting. It's the typical working in your business and not getting the time to work on your business. So I think a lot of times not taking the time to actually build out a system to stop and think, what are the things that I'm selling? What are the actual details of those things? And then what are the appropriate prices? If you don't do that, then you're reinventing the wheel. If you do that, proposal writing becomes less of kind of this painful process and more of Lego building. I had a customer mention the idea of Legoitizing their offering.
That's interesting. Can you talk about that a little more? Like, what are some of the sort of realizations that your clients or customers see from this that they might not come up with without it?
Yeah, well, big idea. Smart Pricing Table is interactive proposal software for professional service companies. Most of my companies are agencies because I know how to talk to agencies, enjoy agencies. So that's the system. And let me give you an example of what a lot of times we find ourselves doing and then a better system. So let's say that you sell social media management and you're going to manage a client's Facebook page, and let's say you're going to charge $1,500 a month for that. Well, it's very easy to be vague and do something simple like that just basically says that I'll manage that. And then you get a couple months into the work and you realize that you don't really want to think about your effective hourly rate. I don't want to actually think about what I'm making on this client because actually that might make me kind of frustrated and I don't want to take that out on them. But maybe they're asking you to respond to comments with their social media management. So you do the posts and you agreed to do 5 a month or something like that. And they assumed that you'd also respond to comments, that you'd manage their page in other ways, like they needed a new profile picture. And so you're just doing that, right? I call that the vague vortex, where because you didn't clarify what's included, it has the ability to just kind of spiral into doing whatever they want. So with a system like Smart Pricing Table, you build proposals or scopes of work one line item at a time. And so I would create a new line item called social media management. And I would say something like, generally my line items start with a summary sentence, and then I'll say work included and a bulleted list, okay? I really like that format because as an agency owner or a service provider, it's easy for me to think through what's included, and it's easy for my prospect to scan when they're actually looking at it. But simple things like limited to 5 posts per month, whether or not you're going to engage with their followers, does it include stuff with their profile? Does it include other social networks? I like to define what's included and what's not included and put a fence around the work.
I love that concept of the vague vortex. I think that's what also can kill deals before before they even happen, right? Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. Is like, to dig into sales process, at what point is this specific definition of what's being done going into the sales process based on your better, more effective customers? Like, at what point are they digging into the nitty gritty of this stuff versus talking from a high level?
Yeah, well, I think when you're in a normal sales conversation, sales discovery call, getting to know your prospect, I think you want to keep it relatively high level. When you get into an actual proposal, then the question is, going back to the social media management line item, how much do I define? Like how detailed do I get? And with many things in life, there's ditches, right? If you're not detailed enough, you end up in the vague vortex. And Dan, I've made minimum wage enough. Agency life can be so elusive, or it can look really, really awesome. And then you look at the actual numbers and it's like, this is painful. And if I wouldn't got a normal job, I'd actually make double my pay. So it's the whole saying, entrepreneurs will work for anything as long as they're working for themselves. So you don't want to be so vague that you're getting slaughtered, but you don't want to be so detailed that it feels like you're boxing in the entire project. And so with something like social media management, I would just put a simple 3 to 4 bulleted point list, maybe some upsells, and we have some really sweet ways we can do upsells with Smart Pricing Table. But you want enough so that you have handles to grab onto.
Yeah.
If you don't have handles, you don't have any control.
Not only that, but I think the handles, communicate strongly that you've done this before and you have the scars to prove it
Right.
versus just like, hey, we'll do this vague thing for you. This is kind of like loosely tied to this, and this may not land right, but I heard an interesting quote from somebody that it's like, if you want to stay small, do stuff you can measure. Right. Which is like, if you look at the biggest agencies like Madison Avenue, they're all doing stuff you can't really measure that well. Right. It's
Right.
just sort of like vague and is amplified a lot and produces massive value. So I think that can play out in ways that are really good and really bad. Right. You could have like a completely unethical agency that's doing nothing that they can, hold any results accountable to. But
Right.
anyway, I'm trying to bring this to a question. I guess, like, how do you feel about that line, and does that have any interplay with the proposal and what you're actually doing?
Some of this comes down to your personality, the way that you run your agency. I didn't like to have things too big. I'm not saying that it doesn't work. I talk with so many different agency owners. I've seen so many different setups, and I think sometimes that can work. For me, I just don't like taking the risk. I want to be able to, say that I had actionable stuff to deliver on and define it enough so that they feel like they've got a good value when things are done. But there's a lot of different processes and ways you can run things and methodology. So I wouldn't say that this is the only way to do it, but it's a great way to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how are these proposals typically being presented by your best clients? And I'll preempt that a little bit, saying that we always encourage people to share stuff live, before it goes out or whatnot. But I do think Loom and video and these sort of things are interesting and are kind of like changing the way remote sales is being done.
Right.
But I'd love to get your perspective on that in terms of the presentation.
Yeah, actually, this is one of the things I talk to a lot of my customers about on the demo or new customers. I like to do something called the proposal review meeting. And I learned this tip from Jason Swank. A shout out. He's got some great stuff
Yeah.
for agency owners.
Hmm.
And when we started using it at my agency, it was a really big deal. So how it works is, and you've probably done this before, Dan, but for your listeners, I'm having a sales discovery call with you, say 30 minutes. And at the end of the call, I say, well, Dan, I really appreciate you scheduling this time with me and downloading all this information. The next step in our process is I'd like to schedule a proposal review meeting with you, 15, 20-minute proposal review meeting to go over what I put together. Now, as I'm doing that, Dan, I'm opening up my Calendly. I'm putting it in their time zone, or I already had it open tab in their time zone. And I simply say, Dan, what's a good day for you? And I'll show you the time slots I have open. Now, you'll note that I didn't ask you, Dan, if you wanted to do a proposal review meeting, and that's
Right.
key.
Yeah.
It's just part of the processor. Tell the customer what to do next. There's
Right.
no rules here. Just make them up, right? So, and I found that 95% of the time, they just go for it. Then the attendance rate on that meeting is extremely high because you have something they want. Likely, they're getting 3-4 proposals, talking to different vendors, and they want to see your proposal. So the attendance rate is really high. But the point of the meeting is I don't want to just create a proposal and chuck it over the fence. I want the opportunity to sell it. Here's why I set it up this way. Here are some additional add-ons that you might want to think about and some benefits to them. During the meeting, you can overcome objections. You can get a sense of whether or not they like the format that you're using. And finally, I'd say I like to send the proposal after the meeting. I don't send it before. They have to go to the meeting in order to get it. But they'll never engage with it on their own as you can get them to engage with it on a meeting. It's just night and day. And so I think the proposal review meeting is just killer.
That's great. You're preaching to the choir there, and that's what we encourage as well for all of our clients. And I think that if you're spending the time on it, you need skin in the game. Mutual time investment. I think where it gets hazier sometimes is, especially selling into big organizations, when to involve which decision makers and that kind of thing. And this is something that we have optimized a lot in our sales process. And it used to be we would really fight to get every single decision maker on the call. But to sort of like find the cost benefit between time investment on our standpoint, we're basically like, look, you don't have to bring this up the line. We don't have to do a long call with all your decision makers. But if you want us to do the work as policy, we need everybody involved in the decision on the next call. So it sort of like balances the time better, and it leaves us doing less chasing, right?
Yeah,
Of
yeah,
people. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like there's different schools of thought. There's some people that will say make sure everybody's on. There's others that will Loom and video recordings do some of the help for them and let that percolate behind the scenes. Sometimes like, if you're selling into a large organization, the CMO may have to just sign off. They may be
right.
that like high level buyer, but they don't really care about the particulars. They're just kind of
Yeah.
rubber stamp. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and how your clients are navigating it.
I think you have to be on your feet. Every single prospect or every single opportunity is going to feel a little bit different. And so as a salesperson, I learned sales at my agency. I love it. I'm asking questions like, how high up the chain is this person? The last thing I want to do is, no offense to executive assistants, they're greatly needed, but I haven't found that a lot of times if I'm pitching directly to them, that I get it actually in front of the CEO or the C-suite person. So it's trying to gauge like, okay, they may not be the top decision maker, but what's their level of influence and their level of authority at the company? The other thing I would say is it never hurts to ask if someone can be. I've had certain meetings where I just say, hey, I know so-and-so couldn't make it. Would it make sense to reschedule this? I'd love for them to be on the call. And again, tell your customer what to do next. You find like, oh, actually, they can join. Let's redo this on Tuesday. I love the acronym from a meeting, book a meeting.
Yeah.
Have you heard of that one, Dan?
I haven't heard the acronym, but it's gospel to what
Yeah.
we do. Yeah.
I learned that from Dan Martell, but it's just so helpful. If you need to reschedule, you need to get someone else on the call. I love just take care of it right then. Then, they're focused. They're not distracted by 1,000 emails. So I always like to ask and try to get any decision makers on the table as possible. And also, obviously, it matters the deal size, right? Like, is this a really big deal? If it's a small one, maybe there's less risk and you just go for it. But I really connect with what you said, Dan, around it's our policy. You defined it, even if it was your policy starting yesterday. I think using that kind of stuff makes it feel more firm and can get some action and more people in the room.
Yeah, it's amazing what that'll do and how much time it'll save, frankly. So I think that stuff's really good. And also just understanding timeframes for this sort of thing. If the time frame, just asking like, when does this need to be, how important is this, what does this need to be settled by, and not just arbitrarily doing a proposal call because
Yeah.
you can, if somebody's like 3 months out, what did that really tell you? So
Right. Yeah. Some of those questions can be a big time saver in agency life. I always remember, like with my team, we'd get this really hard deadline. And I'd always tell my lead project manager, I'd say, did you ask them what's driving that? And you find out it's actually not that solid and they could have some additional room. Or my favorite is, just to hurry up and wait. We need this for a conference. And then, oh yeah, we don't need to work for the conference.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one common thing that we've heard from some people that are kind of like newer at going outside of like referral based business and they're figuring out their process for the first time in a while is sort of like, hey, we're having all these amazing calls with people and then they just don't go anywhere and we have no idea why. And
Right.
I haven't listened to every call every time that issue comes up, but I've listened to enough where usually what's happening is people are going into that sales situation as if it's a active opportunity and an
Right.
inbound referral pitch. So then they're just selling. They're just saying, we
Right.
can do this, we can do that. Here's all this stuff we can do, and blah, blah, blah. And here's the proposal. And then it's crickets. And they've probably asked like 3 questions. So they
Right.
haven't really asked the questions they're afraid to ask, right? Which is
Right.
like, how important is this? You want to say you want to do this. What happens if you don't do this? What happens if you do
Right.
nothing?
Great
What will
questions.
be the effect of that? What is the time frame for doing this? Who has to decide on this? None of those questions are getting asked. So of course, because even if you have an issue in your sales process, if you're asking those questions, you can at least approximate what it is. But if I'm hearing we have no idea why these deals are getting caught up, probably that's usually what's going on, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's so key, going back to my core strength. I think it's so key to systematize things where you can, right? Like, what are the questions that you're asking on that discovery call? What is your pre-qualification strategy so that you're not, spending an hour with the $500 customer and the $50,000 customer the same hour, right? And until you have some kind of written processes or some kind of system, you can improve it, right? So as soon
Yeah.
as you have even a base thing, then you take that system and you try to apply it to the business and you see where the holes are and you're always making it better. And that When I left my agency, I had about 5 hours of crucial work per week. And most of that was just finance that I didn't want to outsource. I think that's the fruit of slow down to speed up, think through things.
Yeah, and for me, like I'm such a hypocrite because I'm always like yelling about how people should improve their processes, but for us it took hiring salespeople to actually figure out what works. It's kind of one of
Yeah,
those things where it's when you're doing it yourself, it's harder to see it, and also practicing what we preach. So like getting sales coaches and consultants and recording calls and sending them to them, and I've been doing this, more than 10 years now in sales roles and still getting almost every call reviewed and getting feedback on them from outsiders helps a lot. So
yeah,
that's
that's great.
that's huge. But anyway, to bring this to more of what you're doing, so we talked about proposal presentation, what goes into building this, potentials for upsells and all these things. What happens after you send it? How do you keep people engaged when it's going wherever it goes?
Yeah, I think that gets back to that checklist, right? What's the post proposal checklist? What are the reminders or the automation that needs to be set up? One of the things that's cool with Smart Pricing Table, most proposal software has analytics built in, some kind of business intelligence on what's going on or some kind of intelligence there. Because we're focused on the scope of work, that's really our strong suit. We actually track not only if they view a page in your proposal, but if they open one of your line items, they expand and collapse, check a box or change a quantity. And along with that comes an email notification that they opened it. So I think that's really key. If you're using Google Docs or Word to generate your proposals, you got to know that that's not proposal software. So it's not going to have features like the fact that they opened the proposal or what they did on it or signatures built right in. So that's one thing. Make sure that you're getting notified that they're opened, and then analyze the analytics. So for instance, one thing that I've done in the past is I have a project kickoff call, and then inside of that, there's an upsell inside of that line item for, let's say, $300-400. They can turn on this upsell and we'll do an on-site meeting with them. Well, if I look at the analytics, it's really powerful for me as a salesperson if I see so-and-so clicked on the About Us page, then they clicked on the scope of work, then they opened the project kickoff call, turned on-site meeting. Like that kind of intelligence helps you understand how serious they are. They're trying to get a firm price, maybe trying to compare apples to apples, or maybe I'm in the top 2-3 considerations. So the intelligence can drive some of the actions as well as them opening it. But I would have a steady, don't just do the typical follow-up emails, but, have a specific question, hey, we sent out the proposal a couple of weeks ago. Were there any specific questions on that? Could I connect with and work through some of the details on it? Try to think of some organic, natural ways that you can keep the conversation going.
Totally agree. We've always, we've seen clients do a number of different tactics to kind of like keep things engaged. We have too. And I think that the way you keep people engaged is kind of dependent on where you're at in the funnel and everything. And by the time a proposal or an agreement or some version of that goes out, what I've found personally is a lot of times it's like a timing game, and it's sort of like tying people to the calendar helps a lot too. We have these slots open, we need to team engaged. If we want to if X needs to happen by Y date, we need to start by Z, kind of thing.
Yeah, building in some urgency, letting them know like, hey, we only have a few spots for May and June. How soon do you think you would know? I like asking timeline questions, like when do you think you guys are going to make a decision? What's the next step in the process? Who's involved? You get some intel there, and then your follow-up emails aren't just following up emails, right? There's like, hey, did you talk to Dave? I know you had mentioned so-and-so, or this thing, is that still in play? Another big one, Dan, I'm sure you're probably a big fan of this too, but I love the short email, kind of to reactivate a customer. Let's say it's been a month.
Yeah.
I love just doing something simple like, hey, Dan, still interested? And that's literally, it's one line, one email. You're trying to reduce the mental processing they have to do on your email so that they can give you a super quick response.
Yeah, and taking that further, I think I've learned a lot from the book Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, which is, people want to say no to protect themselves. And also people are really scared of missing out on anything, right? So I think sometimes you frame that email negatively and you're like, should I assume you've gone in another direction?
I was going to say that. Yeah.
It's absolutely uncanny. The volume, like if I haven't done a deep dive on it, but I would guess the response rates are like 90% on that
Yeah.
email versus dozens of follow-ups and
Yeah.
check-ins and that kind of thing. So
Yeah. Drop the formalities. Dan's doing good. I don't care. It's like, I do care,
yeah,
but you don't care if I know. It's like, hey, Dan, no longer interested.
yeah,
Invite some FOMO in there. But also, I want an answer, right? I've got all
right.
these different sales opportunities. If it's not going anywhere, it'd be helpful for me to know. And so that email can help with that as well.
Right, exactly. And the question is like, when do you send that email? Right. There's not one right answer,
Yeah,
but you don't have anywhere to go after that. That's
right,
it pretty much.
right.
So, but at least you can move on. So I think that's important and everything. And yeah, any tricks to getting these things signed faster? Anything you found there?
Well, I'm going to circle back to the proposal review meeting, because if you can make selections on that meeting, change quantities or whatever that's needed, even with our software, you could even add a quick line item without like if it's from your library, you could just add it real quick because they wanted it. Figure out what options, whatever the case, you actually could ask for a signature on that meeting. I used to watch a show called The Prophet, and he would do that all the time, where it's like he's on a sales discovery call and he tries to ask for the business right there. And it can be very successful. So I think getting the project really clear on that meeting is one of the biggest ways that you can escalate things. And then asking questions. I just think I'm trying to uncover what's driving things, how important it is to them, is all going to frame the strategy I put together for follow-up and getting things going.
Yeah, and this is something we might have covered a little bit earlier, but I guess it's sort of interesting. Like when I think of myself buying upsells, if something's like a low enough price anyway, you'll kind of just buy all the upsells because you're like, yeah, maybe I'll need this, right? Or yeah, maybe
Yeah.
I'll get fudge and peanuts on the ice cream or whatever, whatever it
Yeah.
is. Might as well. So not to put you on the spot, but are there any like examples of that you've seen with your customers where it's like, oh, this thing, we didn't even like think about charging for this thing?
That's huge. I actually have a great story. And just so you know a little bit how Smart Pricing Table could help, I have on one of my sample proposals, which you can find at our website, I have a blog line item, and the blog is, say, $2,000. And then below it, there are interactive upsells. So you can check these boxes for MailChimp integration, $250. Author bio pages, $400. Advanced search for the blog or something like that, $650. And just like you said, Dan, we would find over and over and over, people would click on those things. And it's a big difference between me selling you on something, Dan, and you getting a proposal that's interactive, almost like a brochure, and you turning things on. Let me tell you a fun story. I once had a prospect that said, hey, we'd love a proposal. We have $25,000 and it's a max, and we won't meet with you. And I'm thinking, I'm not really that interested because I don't get to present. And our minimum was about 30 grand or 25 at that point, but that was like bare minimum. We needed the work. And so I decided to just go for it. And I told my sales guy, hey, put together a proposal, deselect a bunch of stuff, and just chuck it over the fence. And it was a bare bones proposal, not very valuable. Didn't hear anything for 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden got a signature request for $34,000. And the point is like, if I had sold them, I said, look, your budget's too small. You're going to need an extra $9,000 for you to actually like this project, right? They would have walked. But because they got an interactive proposal where they could turn things on in a no pressure, low sales environment, or no sales environment, it was a really big win for them. And we got considerably more budget and the project.
Yeah, that's super interesting because it's like runs contrary to like everything that I've done and experienced and believe, but it's like one of those like exceptions that might prove the rule. How extreme of an example do you think that is? How often do you think that can play out? I guess because I'm
Well,
open to be wrong.
I never like throwing proposals over the fence.
Yeah,
Never
yeah,
like that. But if I'm going to, I'm going to spend 10 minutes on it, right? Because
right.
I got templates built and I can just duplicate the template, turn things off, tweak it, send it, right?
Yeah,
I'm going to spend very limited time and then I'm going to chuck it over the fence. I don't generally recommend that, but that's one of the great features of our tool at Smart Pricing Table is it really think rapid scope of work generation, so that in the cases where you can't meet with someone, or it's, could just be a lot of work, you can generate something quickly, give lots of options, and then still run that play. But ideally, you're presenting to them.
Yeah. And what I love about that is there's this kind of like lizard brain thing of people having comfort with being able to select things themselves. And we all like to pretend in B2B that we're all these like rational scientific actors, but it's
Right.
that stuff does matter, you know. So
Yeah.
I could totally see that happening, and that makes a lot of sense. Joe, this has been so much fun. Where can people go to learn more about what you're up to and check out Smart Pricing Table and all that stuff?
Yeah, smartpricingtable.com. You can request a free demo if any of this seems interesting. As I mentioned, most of my customers are agencies. I love the agency space. I know it well. And so that also drives our product roadmap. We also have a free guide called the Profitable Proposal Blueprint on our website that goes over some of the concepts here, but some real good high level stuff that can kind of get you thinking about how to revamp this part of things. And then I'm also big on LinkedIn. I like to, when I have time, do some good posts and tips on proposal writing specifically.
Awesome. And we'll get all that linked up. And Joe, thank you for your time, sir. I really appreciate it.
You as well, Dan. Thanks for having me on the show.